I was standing in my grandmother's rose garden when I heard my mother's voice drift through the open kitchen window. Natalie won't care. She's used to being second. The pruning shears slipped from my grip, falling into the soft earth between the blooms. My breath caught somewhere between my ribs and throat, trapped like everything else I'd swallowed over the years. In that single moment, 30 years of doubt crystallized into absolute certainty. I wasn't their daughter. I was their afterthought. Someone they could use, discard, and never lose sleep over. Someone who would smile through the pain because that's what I'd always done. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Natalie Brooks, and that afternoon in the garden, surrounded by my grandmother's carefully tended roses, I made a decision that would change everything. I would no longer be the daughter who accepted crumbs while her sister feasted. I would no longer nod and agree while they carved up my future like it belonged to them. That day, standing among the thorns and petals, I decided to fight back. Not with screams or tantrums, but with something far more powerful. Patience, strategy, and the one thing they never thought I possessed, the will to take what was rightfully mine. The late August heat clung to Portland like a damp blanket, making everything feel heavier than it should. I had driven out to my grandmother's house in Laurelhurst that Saturday morning with a trunk full of cleaning supplies and a heart full of memories. Grandma Eleanor had passed away 3 months earlier, and the family had been dragging their feet about clearing out her Victorian home. The place sat on a tree-lined street where old money whispered through the leaves, where homes like hers were worth close to $1 million despite their age, or perhaps because of it. The neighborhood had character, history, the kind of permanence that made you feel rooted just by walking its sidewalks. I loved this house. Always had. When I was young and the tension at home became too much, I would ride my bike here, letting myself in through the back gate. Grandma Eleanor would be in her garden, dirt under her fingernails, a wide-brimmed hat shading her face. She never asked questions. She just handed me a trowel and let me dig in the earth beside her until whatever hurt I was carrying felt a little lighter. The roses were her pride, deep reds and soft pinks that bloomed from late spring until the first frost. She'd taught me their names, shown me how to prune them so they'd come back stronger. This garden was where I learned that beauty required tending, that neglect led to withering, and that sometimes you had to cut away the dead parts to let new growth flourish. Now the garden looked tired. 3 months without her touch had left the roses leggy and wild. I'd come early before anyone else might show up, wanting a few hours alone in the space that had always felt more like home than the house I grew up in. My parents lived 20 minutes away in Lake Oswego, in a sprawling house with white columns and a lawn so perfect it looked painted. Everything there gleamed, everything there performed, and everything there revolved around my younger sister, Jessica. I pulled on my gardening gloves and knelt in the soil, starting with the nearest bush. The repetitive motion soothed me, clipping away the spent blooms, clearing space for what might still grow. I was so absorbed in the work that I didn't hear the car pull up, didn't notice the voices until they were close enough that the words drifted clearly through the kitchen window I'd opened to let in some air. My mother's voice came first, that particular tone she used when she was working through a problem, clinical and certain. "We'll need to list the house by October if we want to close before the holidays. The market's good right now. Robert, did you get the appraiser's number from David?" My father's reply was muffled, but I caught the gist. He'd been in contact with David Morrison, the estate attorney. They were already making plans, already moving pieces on a board I hadn't realized we were playing on. Then my mother again, closer to the window now. "Once we sell, we can split the proceeds. Jessica's been through so much with the condo purchase. We should make sure she gets a fair share to offset what we already gave her." Another voice joined them. "Jessica." My sister's laugh tinkled like wind chimes, light and careless. "Mom, you're being too generous. But honestly, I could use it. Kyle and I are already talking about renovating the kitchen. Those builder-grade cabinets are awful." My hand stilled on the rose stem I'd been trimming. The thorns bit through my gloves, but I barely felt it. They were discussing the sale of Grandma Eleanor's house as if it were already decided. As if the will hadn't been read yet. As if I didn't exist in this equation at all. Patricia, my mother, spoke again. Her voice dropped, but in the quiet of the garden, I heard every word. "Natalie won't care. She's used to being second. And honestly, Robert, she doesn't need the money like Jessica does. Natalie's always been fine with less. Just her personality. The pruning shears fell from my hands. I stared down at them, half buried in the dark soil, and felt something inside me crack wide open. Not with sound, but with a silence so profound it swallowed everything else. They weren't just planning to sell the house. They were planning to cut me out, to justify it with the fiction that I preferred scraps, that I was somehow built to endure deprivation while Jessica was entitled to abundance. I pressed my palm into the dirt, grounding myself, forcing air into my lungs. Inside the house they continued talking, oblivious. My father mentioned something about updating the listing photos. Jessica wondered aloud if they should stage the place or sell it as is. My mother suggested clearing out the furniture first, donating most of it, maybe keeping a few pieces for Jessica's condo. Not once did anyone say my name again. Not once did anyone suggest I might have feelings about this house, about the woman who'd lived here, about the memories soaked into every floorboard. I was erased from the narrative before it even began, dismissed as someone who wouldn't fight, wouldn't protest, wouldn't matter. I stood slowly, my knees stiff from kneeling, my heart a clenched fist in my chest. Through the window, I could see them gathered around Grandma Eleanor's kitchen table. My mother shuffled papers, probably estimates from the appraiser. My father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, nodding along. Jessica perched on the counter, swinging her legs, scrolling through her phone, looking bored but entitled to be there. They looked like a complete family, a unit. And I, standing outside in the garden with dirt on my hands, was the ghost they'd already stopped seeing. I could have stormed inside, could have demanded answers, thrown their words back at them, made a scene that would force them to acknowledge me. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way Grandma Eleanor had taught me to prune roses, carefully, strategically, removing only what needed to go. Maybe it was the 30 years of training that had taught me to swallow anger, to smooth over conflict, to make myself smaller so others could expand. Or maybe, for the first time in my life, it was the cold, clarifying rage that came from finally seeing the truth. They expected me to fold. They'd built their entire plan on the assumption that I would accept whatever they handed me with a grateful smile. And why wouldn't they? I'd spent 3 decades doing exactly that. When I was 8, Jessica turned 5, and my parents threw her a birthday party that belonged in a magazine. They rented a bounce house, hired a face painter, and ordered a custom cake shaped like a castle. I helped set up, hung streamers, and blew up balloons. My own 8th birthday 3 years earlier had been a grocery store sheet cake and a handful of cousins in our backyard. When I asked my mother why the difference, she cupped my face and said, "You understand, don't you, sweetheart? You're the big sister. You're mature enough not to need all the fuss." I'd nodded because that's what good big sisters did. They understood. They didn't make waves. When I graduated high school, I walked across the stage to collect my diploma, scanning the audience for familiar faces. My parents weren't there. They'd driven Jessica 2 hours south to tour a college campus she was interested in, even though she was only a sophomore. "You understand," my mother had said on the phone that morning. "This visit was the only time that worked with the admissions office. We'll celebrate your graduation when we get back." We never did. By the time they returned, the moment had passed, and I'd learned another lesson about my place in the family hierarchy. College was a patchwork of scholarships, loans, and late-night shifts at a diner near campus. My parents helped with Jessica's tuition, bought her a car, sent care packages. I got a card on my birthday if they remembered. After graduation, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I moved into a tiny studio apartment in the Pearl District, a 4th-floor walk-up with street noise that never stopped. It was cramped and loud, but it was mine. Jessica, meanwhile, had stayed at home after college rent-free, saving money while she figured out what she wanted to do. Then, 6 months ago, my parents handed Jessica a check for $150,000. A down payment on a downtown condo, 15th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. I found out about it on Instagram. Jessica posted a photo of herself holding the keys, caption reading, "Dreams do come true. Thank you to the best parents in the world." The comments flooded in. Friends congratulating her. Strangers praising my parents' generosity. I stared at that post for 20 minutes, my coffee going cold in my hand, waiting for the anger to hit. It never did. Just a dull, familiar ache, the kind I'd grown so used to it felt like part of my skeleton. I didn't call. Didn't text. What would I say? Instead, I went to work, smiled through my shift, came home to my studio, and told myself it didn't matter. Jessica needed help. I was fine. I'd always been fine. That's what I did. I made it fine because the alternative was looking directly at the truth, and the truth was too ugly, too painful, too destabilizing. But standing in that garden, eavesdropping on my own erasure, I couldn't make it fine anymore. The truth wasn't just ugly. It was undeniable. My parents had decided long before Grandma Eleanor's death that Jessica's needs outweighed mine, that her comfort, her happiness, her future mattered more. And now they were going to sell the one place that had ever felt like it belonged to me, the one inheritance that should have been split equally, and they were going to do it without guilt, without hesitation, because they believed I wouldn't resist. I picked up the pruning shears, wiped the dirt off the blades, and set them carefully in my gardening basket. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. I walked around to the front of the house, climbed the porch steps, and opened the door. They all looked up when I entered the kitchen. My mother's expression flickered with surprise before settling into a bright, false smile. "Natalie, I didn't know you were here. We were just discussing some plans for the house." I set my basket down on the counter, pulled off my gloves, and met her eyes. I heard. The room went still. My father shifted in his chair. Jessica stopped scrolling and looked up, her face uncertain. My mother's smile wavered but held. "Oh, well, good. Then you know we're trying to get everything organized. It's a lot of work, but we want to handle it properly." I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Then I smiled, the same smile I'd been giving them my entire life. The one that said I understood, that I wouldn't make trouble, that I'd go along with whatever they decided. "That sounds good, Mom. I'm sure you'll handle it well. You always do." Relief washed over her face. My father relaxed. Jessica went back to her phone. They thought the moment had passed. They thought I'd accepted my role once again. But as I stood there, nodding along to their plans, agreeing with their timeline, offering to help with the clearing out, something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't agreeing because I was compliant. I was agreeing because I'd learned something crucial in that garden. The best way to win a battle your opponents don't know you're fighting is to let them believe they've already won. I stayed for another hour, listening as they discussed contractors and real estate agents. I asked questions that made me sound helpful, invested in their success. When my mother mentioned that the estate still hadn't gone through probate, that David Morrison was handling the legal details, I made a mental note. When my father casually mentioned that Grandma Eleanor's will was being finalized and they'd all know the details soon, I smiled and said I was sure everything would be straightforward. Jessica, sprawled across Grandma's favorite armchair like she owned it, sighed dramatically. "I just hope this doesn't drag on forever. Kyle and I want to start renovations by spring." My mother patted her hand. "Don't worry, sweetheart. We'll make sure you're taken care of." I watched this exchange, my face pleasant, my hands folded in my lap. Inside, I was cataloging every word, every assumption, every careless dismissal. They were building their plan on a foundation of sand, and they didn't even know it. When I finally left that afternoon, driving back to my cramped studio through the thick Portland traffic, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, though that was there too. Not sadness, though that familiar ache still pressed against my ribs. What I felt was clarity. Sharp, cold, undeniable clarity. For 30 years, I played the role they'd written for me. The understanding daughter. The one who didn't need as much. The one who made herself small so others could be big. I told myself it was maturity, that I was being the bigger person, that family meant sacrifice. But it wasn't sacrifice when only one person was expected to give. It was exploitation. And I was done. That night, in my tiny apartment with the street noise filtering through thin walls, I sat at my makeshift desk and opened my laptop. I pulled up the email David Morrison had sent to all of us 3 months ago, after Grandma Eleanor's funeral. It was a formal message about the estate, about probate, about patience during the legal process. At the bottom, his contact information sat in a tidy signature line. I stared at that email for a long time. Then I opened a new message and began to type. "Dear Mr. Morrison, I hope this email finds you well. I wanted to reach out regarding my grandmother Eleanor Brooks' estate. I understand the will is still in probate, but I'd appreciate the opportunity to discuss the details at your earliest convenience. Would you have time for a meeting this week? I have some questions about the process and want to make sure I understand my grandmother's wishes clearly. Thank you for your time. Best regards, Natalie Brooks. I read it over 3 times before hitting send. It was polite, measured, giving nothing away. Exactly the kind of email they'd expect from me. But underneath the pleasantries was a question they'd never anticipated I'd ask. What did Grandma Eleanor actually want? Because here's what my parents had forgotten. In their rush to carve up her estate, Grandma Eleanor had loved me. She'd seen me in ways they never had. And if there was even a chance that she'd left instructions, provisions, anything that contradicted their narrative, I needed to know. The response came the next morning. Mr. Morrison could see me Thursday at 2. I confirmed immediately, then closed my laptop and sat in the quiet of my apartment, listening to the sounds of the city waking up below. Delivery trucks rumbling past. A bus hissing to a stop. Voices calling to each other in the street. I thought about my mother's words in the garden. Natalie won't care. She's used to being second. She was right about one thing. I was used to it. 30 years of practice had made me an expert at swallowing disappointment, at rationalizing neglect, at convincing myself that needing less made me virtuous rather than diminished. But she was wrong about the rest. I did care. I'd always cared. I just buried it so deep that even I had forgotten it was there. Not anymore. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. David Morrison's office sat on the 10th floor of a downtown building with views that stretched across the Willamette River. The waiting area smelled like leather and old books, the kind of place where serious conversations happen behind closed doors. I arrived 15 minutes early, my hands gripping a folder containing every document I could find related to Grandma Eleanor. Old birthday cards she'd sent me, photos of us in her garden, a handwritten recipe for her famous blackberry pie that she'd given me years ago with a note that said, "For when you have your own kitchen worth cooking in." I wasn't sure what I'd need, but I wanted proof that I'd mattered to her, that our relationship had been real and deep. The receptionist led me back at exactly 2 o'clock. David Morrison stood as I entered, extending his hand across a mahogany desk that probably cost more than 6 months of my rent. He was older than I expected, maybe late 60s, with silver hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, his smile professional but not cold. "We need to talk about your grandmother's estate," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "I appreciate you reaching out. There are some complexities I've been meaning to discuss with the family." My heart picked up speed, but I kept my expression calm. I folded my hands in my lap, the same posture I'd learned as a child when adults were talking, and I needed to appear attentive and unthreatening. "I just want to understand her wishes," I said quietly. "My parents have been making plans, and I want to make sure we're honoring what she actually wanted." David leaned back in his chair, studying me over the rim of his glasses. "Your grandmother was very specific in her instructions," he said. "She updated her will 18 months ago, not long after her diagnosis." He paused, letting that information settle. "She knew she didn't have much time, and she wanted to make certain her estate was distributed according to her values." I swallowed hard. The diagnosis had been kept quiet. Grandma Eleanor had stage 4 pancreatic cancer, but she'd refused aggressive treatment. She'd told me during one of my visits, sitting in her garden with tea growing cold between us, "I'm 87 years old, Natalie. I've had a beautiful life. I'm not going to spend my last month sick from chemicals just to buy a few more weeks." I'd held her hand and cried, and she brushed my tears away with fingers that smelled like rose petals and earth. David pulled a thick document from his desk drawer. "This is Eleanor's will," he said. "As her attorney, I'm bound to execute it exactly as written. But I'll be honest with you, there are aspects of it that may surprise your family." He paused, meeting my eyes directly. "Your grandmother left very clear instructions about who should inherit what and why." My mouth went dry. "Can you tell me what those instructions are?" He slid the document across the desk. "In summary, Eleanor left the Laurelhurst house and all its contents to you, Natalie. Solely to you. The liquid assets, her savings and investment accounts, are to be split equally between you and Jessica. But the house, which represents the bulk of the estate's value, goes entirely to you. The words hit me like cold water. I stared at the document, at the formal legal language that spelled out what he just said. The house was mine. All of it. Not split, not negotiated, not contingent on my parents' approval. Mine. Why? The question came out barely above a whisper. David smiled, the professional mask slipping just enough to show something warmer underneath. She included a letter explaining her reasoning. It's not legally binding, but it provides context. Would you like to read it? I nodded, not trusting my voice. He pulled out a sealed envelope, my name written across the front in Grandma Eleanor's shaky handwriting. I took it with trembling fingers, carefully breaking the seal. The letter was 2 pages, written on her personal stationery, the kind with small roses printed along the border. Her handwriting wandered across the lines, weaker than I remembered, but still unmistakably hers. My dearest Natalie, it began. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I hope you're not too sad. I've lived long enough to know that death is just another season, and I'm ready for whatever comes next. But before I go, I need to tell you something I should have said more clearly when I was alive. You deserved better from your family. I watched you grow up in the shadow of your sister, watched you make yourself smaller and quieter so she could shine brighter. I watched your parents pour resources and attention into Jessica while giving you just enough to survive. It broke my heart, but I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that parents have the right to make their own choices even when those choices are wrong. I regret that silence now. I should have said something. I should have fought for you the way you deserve to be fought for. This house is my attempt to correct that imbalance, however late it comes. You loved this place the way I loved it. You understood the garden, the history, the care it requires. Jessica never did. She sees real estate value. You see home. I'm leaving it to you because you earned it with every visit, every hour you spent with me when no one else could be bothered, every conversation we had in the garden while the rest of the family was too busy for an old woman. This is not a gift, Natalie. This is recognition. You were always enough even when they made you feel like you weren't. I hope this house gives you a foundation to build the life you deserve, the one you've been denied for too long. I love you. I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry I didn't do more sooner. Grandma Eleanor. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face, smudging the ink on the edges where my fingers gripped too tightly. David sat quietly, letting me have the moment, his expression sympathetic but not pitying. When I finally looked up, my voice was rough. Does anyone else know about this? Not yet, he said. I've been trying to schedule a formal reading with all parties present, but your parents have been difficult to pin down. They keep postponing, saying they're too busy or that there's no rush. I suspect they assume they already know what the will says and see no urgency in making it official. They're planning to sell the house, I said flatly. They've already contacted an appraiser. They think it's going to be split between Jessica and me, or maybe just given to Jessica outright since she's their priority. David's expression hardened. They can't sell what they don't own. The moment Eleanor passed, that house became yours. Probate is just a formality to satisfy the courts. If your parents attempt to list or sell the property, they'll be acting fraudulently, and I'll intervene immediately. Relief and anger swirled together in my chest, making it hard to breathe. I looked down at the letter again, at Grandma Eleanor's words written in her final months. She'd known. She'd seen everything I tried to pretend wasn't happening, and she'd done something about it. What do I do now? I asked. David folded his hands on the desk. You have a few options. We can proceed with a formal reading immediately, informing your family of the will's contents in an official capacity. That's the most straightforward approach. Or if you prefer, you can take some time to process this information before we make it public. The estate isn't going anywhere, and you're under no obligation to rush. I thought about my parents in Grandma Eleanor's kitchen, dividing up her estate like it was theirs to distribute. I thought about Jessica swinging her legs from the counter, bored and entitled, already planning how to spend money that would never be hers. I thought about my mother's voice drifting through the window. Natalie won't care. She's used to being second. Let's wait, I said slowly. I want to handle this carefully. If we tell them now, they'll fight. They'll contest the will, claim Grandma Eleanor wasn't in her right mind, make it ugly and public. But if I let them continue with their plans, let them believe they're in control, maybe they'll reveal more about their intentions. Maybe they'll say or do something that makes their position indefensible. David raised an eyebrow. You want to let them think they're winning? I want them to hang themselves, I said quietly. I've spent 30 years being understanding, being accommodating, being the daughter who doesn't make waves. They're counting on that. They've built their entire strategy around my predictability, so I'll give them exactly what they expect. I'll be helpful and compliant and supportive of their plans. And when the moment is right, when they're most confident, we'll pull the rug out. David studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I can work with that. But Natalie, you need to be prepared. When the truth comes out, they're going to be angry. This will likely destroy your relationship with your family permanently. I looked down at Grandma Eleanor's letter one more time, at the words that finally gave me permission to stop shrinking. Then I met David's eyes. The relationship was already destroyed, I said. I just didn't want to see it. Maybe it's time they saw what they created. We spent the next hour going over details. David explained the probate timeline, the legal protections I had, the steps we'd need to take once we went public. He gave me his personal cell phone number and told me to call immediately if my parents attempted anything regarding the house. Then he walked me to the door, shook my hand again, and said something that stayed with me long after I left his office. Your grandmother was one of the wisest people I've ever known. If she believed in you enough to do this, there's a reason. Trust that. I drove back to my studio in a daze, parking on the street and climbing the 4 flights of stairs without really feeling my legs move. Inside, I set my bag down, pulled out Grandma Eleanor's letter, and read it again. Then I pulled out my phone and did something I hadn't done in months. I called Jessica. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice bright and cheerful. Nat. Hey, what's up? I forced warmth into my tone. Hey, Jess. I was just thinking about you. How's the condo? She launched into a detailed description of her renovation plans, the contractors she was interviewing, the tile samples she was agonizing over. I made appropriate sounds of interest, asked follow-up questions, played the role of supportive older sister with practiced ease. After 15 minutes of listening to her talk about herself, I gently steered the conversation. So, I've been thinking about Grandma's house, I said carefully. Mom and Dad mentioned they're planning to sell it. That makes sense, right? It's a lot of space for just sitting empty. Jessica sighed dramatically. Oh my God, finally someone reasonable. Mom's been worried you'd be weird about it, all sentimental or whatever. But yeah, it needs to be sold. The market's good right now, and honestly, Nat, Kyle and I could really use the extra money. The condo was such a blessing from Mom and Dad, but renovations are so expensive. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste copper. Of course, I said smoothly. I'm happy to help however I can. Do they need me to do anything? Clear out rooms, organize estate sale stuff? Her relief was audible. That would be amazing. Mom's been stressed about all the work. If you could handle some of the heavy lifting, literally, that would be such a help. I do it myself, but I'm just so busy with the condo and Kyle's work schedule is insane right now. No problem, I said. That's what family's for, right? You're the best, Nat, seriously. I know I don't say it enough, but you're such a good sister. I smiled at my reflection in the window, seeing something in my expression I didn't quite recognize. Thanks, Jess. That means a lot. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment and let the mask fall away. My face was calm, blank, neutral. The performance was over. Jessica had just confirmed everything I needed to know. She expected the house to be sold. She expected to profit from it. And she expected me to help make it happen while she reaped the benefits. Over the next few weeks, I played my role perfectly. I showed up at Grandma Eleanor's house multiple times, ostensibly to clean and organize. My parents praised my helpfulness. Jessica texted me thank you emojis. I sorted through decades of accumulated belongings, setting aside items for donation, packing up dishes and linens, taking photos of furniture for potential estate sales. But I also did something else. I documented everything. I photographed the rose garden, now overgrown but still beautiful. I took pictures of every room, capturing the original woodwork, the built-in bookshelves, the sunlight streaming through leaded glass windows. I sat in Grandma Eleanor's favorite chair and recorded a voice memo about my memories in this house, my childhood visits, the conversations we'd had, the love I'd felt within these walls. I wasn't sure what I'd do with these records, but I wanted proof. Proof that this place mattered, that it wasn't just real estate value on a spreadsheet. One afternoon, my mother stopped by while I was working in the dining room. She looked around at the boxes I'd packed, the organized chaos, and smiled approvingly. "You're doing such a good job, Natalie. This is exactly what we needed. Your father and I really appreciate it." I looked up from the china I was wrapping in newspaper. "It's no problem, Mom. I want to help." She sat down across from me, her expression softening into something that might have been affection if I didn't know better. "You know, I was talking to Jessica yesterday, and she mentioned how supportive you've been about the house situation. That maturity, that understanding, it's exactly why your father and I have always known we could count on you. You're just built differently than Jessica. You don't need as much. You're stronger." The words were meant as a compliment, but they landed like stones. I kept my hand steady, kept wrapping the delicate plates, kept my voice even. "I appreciate you saying that." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "When this house sells and we divide everything up, we want you to know that we see how much work you've put in. We're thinking of giving you a slightly larger share to compensate for your time. Maybe an extra $5,000 or so. Does that sound fair?" $5,000. Extra. As compensation for doing all the work while they plan to give the bulk of the proceeds to Jessica. I looked at my mother's face, saw the genuine belief that she was being generous, that this token gesture erased 30 years of inequality. "That's very thoughtful, Mom," I said quietly. "Thank you." She beamed, stood up, and kissed the top of my head like I was still a child. "You're a good daughter, Natalie. We're lucky to have you." After she left, I sat alone in the dining room surrounded by boxes of Grandma Eleanor's belongings. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just added this conversation to the mental catalog of evidence I was building. Every dismissal, every casual cruelty, every moment they revealed exactly how little they valued me. I was collecting ammunition, and they were handing it to me gift-wrapped. That evening, I called David Morrison from my car, parked on a quiet street near Grandma's house. "I need to know something," I said. "When we do the formal reading, when we tell them the truth, can we do it publicly? Not in your office, somewhere they can't control the narrative or hide what happens next." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What did you have in mind?" I thought about Jessica's Instagram posts, about the way my family curated their public image so carefully, about the country club memberships and the perfectly staged family photos. "I want them to understand what it feels like to be exposed," I said. "To have their true selves seen by people who matter to them. Is there a way to do the reading at a family gathering? Something where other people are present?" David was quiet for a moment. "We could arrange for the reading to take place at any location you choose, as long as all parties are properly notified and present. If you wanted witnesses beyond immediate family, that's your prerogative as the primary beneficiary." "Good," I said, "because I think I know exactly when and where this needs to happen." My parents were hosting their annual holiday party in 3 weeks. It was a tradition, a December event where they invited extended family, close friends, business associates. It was a performance, a showcase of their successful life, their perfect family, their generous spirit. Everyone who mattered to them would be there. And that's where I wanted the truth to come out. Not in the privacy of a lawyer's office where they could control the fallout, but in front of everyone they'd spent years impressing. In front of the aunts and uncles who'd watched them favor Jessica. In front of the family friends who'd congratulated them on raising such a well-adjusted older daughter who never complained. In front of the country club acquaintances who saw only the polished surface. I wanted them to see my parents as they really were. And I wanted my parents to know what it felt like to be exposed, judged, and found wanting by the people whose opinions they valued most. David listened to my plan, asked a few clarifying questions, then said something that surprised me. "Your grandmother would have approved. She always said the best disinfectant is sunlight." We finalized the details over the next few days. David would attend the party as my guest, under the pretense of being a family friend. At a predetermined moment, he would announce that he needed to conduct the formal reading of Eleanor's will since all parties were conveniently gathered. It would seem spontaneous, but it would be carefully choreographed. Legal, binding, and utterly devastating. The invitations to the holiday party went out. I received mine in the mail, a thick cream cardstock with my name written in calligraphy. I texted my mother that I'd be there and asked if I could bring a +1. She responded immediately with enthusiasm, telling me she was so glad I was dating again, asking what his name was. I told her David, which wasn't technically a lie. She didn't need to know he was 68 and an estate attorney. Jessica posted about the party on social media, calling it her favorite family tradition, sharing throwback photos from previous years. In every photo she was centered, glowing, surrounded by relatives and friends. I appeared in the background of a few shots, a blur at the edge of the frame, easy to miss if you weren't looking for me. I studied those photos carefully. That's who I'd been. The background player. The supporting character in someone else's story. But in 3 weeks the narrative was going to shift. The camera was going to turn, the focus was going to change, and for the first time in my life I was going to be seen exactly as I was. Not the understanding daughter. Not the one who needed less. Not the afterthought they could erase with casual cruelty. The one who'd been paying attention all along. The one who'd inherited everything they'd assumed was theirs. The one who was done being invisible. I marked the party date on my calendar in red ink. Then I went back to Grandma Eleanor's house and kept cleaning, kept organizing, kept playing the role they expected while counting down the days until everything changed. The week before the holiday party, my mother called with a request that would have broken me 6 months earlier. Natalie, sweetheart, I need a favor. Jessica's been so overwhelmed with the condo renovations, and I thought it would be wonderful if you could help me set up for the party. You know, like old times. You always had such a good eye for these things. I closed my eyes and counted to 3 before responding. Of course, Mom. I'd be happy to help. What do you need? Her relief poured through the phone. Oh, thank you, darling. Could you come over on Friday? We'll do the decorations together, and I'll order lunch. It'll be fun, just the two of us. Just the two of us. The phrase she used when she needed free labor but wanted to frame it as quality time. I'd heard it a dozen times growing up, always before some task that required hours of work Jessica was conveniently too busy to help with. But I kept my voice warm and agreeable. That sounds perfect. I'll be there around 10. The morning I drove to Lake Oswego, the December sky hung low and gray, threatening rain that hadn't quite decided to fall. My parents' house sat on a cul-de-sac where every lawn looked professionally maintained and every car in every driveway cost more than I made in a year. I pulled up behind my father's Mercedes and sat for a moment, staring at the white columns flanking their front door. The wreath already hung with perfect precision. This house had never felt like home. Even growing up, I'd always felt like a guest. Someone who needed to watch her step and mind her manners. Jessica had sprawled across every surface with careless ownership, but I'd moved through these rooms carefully, trying not to take up too much space. My mother opened the door before I could knock, pulling me into a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and coffee. Come in, come in. I've got everything laid out in the dining room. This is going to be our best party yet. The dining room table was covered with decoration boxes, each one labeled in my mother's neat handwriting. Garland, ornaments, table settings, candles. She'd always been organized, always planned everything down to the smallest detail. Control was her love language, or maybe her only language. We spent the next 4 hours transforming the house into something that belonged in a magazine spread. Gold and silver garland draped across the mantel. White lights woven through the banister. Centerpieces arranged with mathematical precision on every available surface. My mother directed while I climbed ladders, hung wreaths, and adjusted angles until everything met her exacting standards. Around noon she ordered sandwiches from a local deli, the expensive kind on artisan bread with ingredients I couldn't pronounce. We sat at the kitchen island, and for a brief moment, I wondered if this could be what she'd promised. Quality time. Connection. The kind of mother-daughter relationship I'd watched other people have but never experienced myself. Then she started talking. You know, Natalie, I've been thinking about your future. You're 32 now, and you're still in that little apartment. Have you thought about what comes next? Because once we sell Eleanor's house, you'll have some money to work with. Nothing like what Jessica got, of course, but enough to maybe put toward a down payment somewhere more affordable. Maybe out in Gresham or further east. You could get a nice condo out there for what you'd have. I took a bite of my sandwich, chewing slowly, buying time to keep my expression neutral. That's something to think about, I said carefully. She nodded, warming to her subject. And really, it would be good for you to have a place of your own. At your age, living in a studio, it just doesn't project the right image. When you meet someone, when you start dating seriously, you'll want to be able to bring them somewhere nice. Somewhere that shows you've got your life together. The implications hung in the air between us, each one a small cut. That my studio wasn't nice. That my life wasn't together. That meeting someone was the ultimate measure of success and I was failing at it. These weren't new criticisms. They were old refrains I'd heard in variations my entire life, always framed as concern, always delivered with a smile. I'm doing okay, Mom, I said quietly. I'm happy where I am. She reached across the counter and patted my hand, her expression sympathetic in a way that made my skin crawl. I know you say that, sweetheart. But happiness isn't just about settling. It's about wanting more for yourself. Jessica has always had that drive, that ambition. I just worry that you've gotten comfortable with less than you deserve. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. She was lecturing me about settling while simultaneously planning to shortchange me on an inheritance, while praising the daughter who'd been handed everything and earned nothing. But I just nodded, squeezed her hand back and said what she needed to hear. You're right. I should think bigger. Maybe this is a good opportunity to reevaluate things. Her face lit up with genuine pleasure. That's my girl. You know, your father and I have always known you were capable of more. You just needed a little push sometimes. After lunch, we finished the decorations. My mother stepped back to survey our work, hands on her hips, satisfaction written across her features. Perfect. This is exactly the image I want to project. Elegant, warm, family-oriented. People need to see what we've built here. What we've built. As if I'd had any part in constructing this facade. As if the years of favoritism and inequality had been a joint family project we'd all agreed to. I looked around at the perfectly arranged house, at the expensive decorations and carefully curated atmosphere, and saw it for what it was. A performance. A lie wrapped in gold garland and white lights. I helped her carry the empty boxes back to the garage, and as we walked through the house, she talked about the guest list. Extended family I hadn't seen in years. Business associates of my father's. Friends from the country club. The mayor's wife was coming. So was the president of the historical society. This wasn't just a party. It was a social event. A chance for my parents to remind everyone of their status and standing. Perfect, I thought. The bigger the audience, the harder the fall. That evening, I met with David Morrison one final time before the party. We sat in his office as the sun set over downtown Portland, reviewing every detail of the plan. He walked me through exactly how the reading would proceed, what he would say, what legal authority he had to conduct it in this manner. He showed me copies of all the relevant documents, asked if I was certain I wanted to proceed this way. I'm certain, I said. They need to know what it feels like to be humiliated in front of people they care about. They need to understand that actions have consequences, even when you thought you'd gotten away with it. David studied me for a long moment. You've changed since that first meeting. You seem harder somehow. I considered that. Not harder. Just done pretending. I spent 3 decades being soft, being understanding, being the person who absorbed everyone else's cruelty so they could stay comfortable. I'm not doing that anymore. He nodded slowly. Your grandmother would be proud of you. She knew you were stronger than they gave you credit for. I looked down at my hands, at the fingers that had spent hours hanging decorations in a house that had never welcomed me, that had organized and cleaned and managed the estate they thought they were stealing. I hope she knows I'm finally fighting back. Even if it's too late for her to see it. It's not too late, David said gently. She knew. That's why she wrote that letter. That's why she left everything to you. She saw this moment coming and she gave you the tools to win. The night before the party, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my studio apartment listening to the city sounds below, running through scenarios in my mind. How they'd react. What they'd say. Whether they'd try to fight it in the moment or wait until later to unleash their anger. I thought about the aunts and uncles who'd watched me grow up in Jessica's shadow, who'd sometimes pulled me aside at family gatherings to say they thought my parents were too hard on me, but who'd never said anything publicly, never intervened. I thought about my father's business associates who'd praised him as a family man, who'd listened to his stories about Jessica's accomplishments and never asked why he never mentioned me. Thought about the country club friends who'd celebrated Jessica's condo purchase, who'd called my parents generous and wonderful, who'd bought into the carefully constructed narrative without questioning what lay beneath. They were all going to be there tomorrow. They were all going to witness the truth. And while part of me felt sick with anticipation, another part felt something cleaner, sharper. Justice. Not revenge, though I knew many would see it that way. Justice for the child I'd been ignored at her own birthday party. Justice for the teenager who'd walked across a graduation stage to an empty audience. Justice for the young woman who'd worked herself to exhaustion while her sister was handed opportunities on a silver platter. Justice for 32 years of being told I needed less because I was somehow built to withstand deprivation. I got up around 3 in the morning and pulled out Grandma Eleanor's letter, reading it by the glow of the streetlight outside my window. You deserved better from your family. The words had burned themselves into my memory, but I needed to see them again. Needed the reminder that I wasn't being vindictive or cruel. I was simply refusing to be erased. The day of the party dawned cold and clear. One of those December days in Portland where the sky turns impossibly blue and the air bites with winter promise. I spent the morning getting ready with more care than I usually took. I chose a deep green dress, elegant but not flashy, expensive but not obviously so. I did my makeup carefully, styled my hair, wore the pearl earrings Grandma Eleanor had given me for my college graduation, the ones my parents hadn't been there to see me receive. David would meet me at the party. He'd arrive separately, playing the role of my date convincingly enough that no one would question it. The plan was simple. We'd wait until most of the guests had arrived, until the party was in full swing and everyone was gathered in the main living areas. Then he'd make his announcement, call everyone's attention, and conduct the reading right there in front of all of them. I arrived at my parents' house at 6, when the party was scheduled to start. Early, as always, the reliable daughter who showed up to help. My mother was in the kitchen, directing caterers, her own dress immaculate, her hair perfect. She saw me and her face broke into a smile. Natalie, you look beautiful. That color is perfect on you. Come here, help me with these appetizer trays. I spent the next 30 minutes arranging cheese and crackers, setting out napkins, making sure the bar was properly stocked. Jessica arrived fashionably late at 6:30, her husband Kyle trailing behind her, both of them dressed like they were attending a gala instead of a family party. She air-kissed my cheek, complimented my dress in a tone that somehow made it sound like an insult, and immediately began holding court in the living room. Guests arrived in a steady stream. Aunt Margaret with her new husband, Uncle Tom and his college-age kids, my father's business partner and his wife, the neighbors from 2 houses down, the historical society president, the mayor's wife. Face after face, all of them people my parents wanted to impress, people whose opinions mattered in their carefully constructed social world. I floated through the crowd saying hello to people I barely knew, accepting compliments on how grown up I looked, how nice it was to see me. Several people asked what I'd been up to, and I gave vague, pleasant answers. Working. Staying busy. You know how it is. They nodded and moved on, their interest in me exhausted within seconds. At 7:15 David arrived. I met him at the door, and he played his part perfectly, shaking my father's hand, complimenting my mother's decorations, acting every bit the respectable boyfriend meeting the family. My mother pulled me aside, whispering that he seemed very distinguished, very appropriate. I smiled and said he was special. We circulated through the party separately for a while, letting the evening develop its own rhythm. Watched my parents work the room, my father with his hand on shoulders and hearty laugh, my mother with her gracious hostess routine. I watched Jessica pose for photos with various guests, her phone constantly in her hand, documenting every moment for social media. I saw the performance from a distance, saw how carefully they'd all constructed this image of family harmony and success. At 8 o'clock, most of the guests had arrived and the party was reaching its peak energy. People were drinking, laughing, the noise level rising with that particular sound of a successful social gathering. I caught David's eye across the room and gave him a slight nod. He moved toward the center of the living room, and I watched him go, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. This was it. The moment I'd been planning for weeks, the culmination of 32 years of swallowed anger and forced compliance. There was no going back after this. Once the truth came out, my relationship with my family would be over. Permanently. Irreparably. Completely. I thought I was prepared for that. I told myself I was strong enough to lose them because I'd never really had them. But standing there, watching David position himself where everyone could see him, I felt a wave of something that might have been grief or might have been fear or might have been both. Then I remembered my mother's voice in the garden. Natalie won't care. She's used to being second. I remember being 8 years old, watching Jessica's birthday party from the kitchen window, while eating lukewarm pizza alone. I remembered standing on a graduation stage, scanning the crowd for faces that weren't there. I remembered opening Instagram to see my sister holding keys to a condo purchased with money my parents claimed they didn't have when I'd asked for help with textbooks. I remembered every single moment they'd chosen her over me, every time they'd made me feel small and grateful for scraps, every casual cruelty delivered with a smile. The grief evaporated. The fear dissolved. What remained was clear, cold certainty. David cleared his throat and raised his voice slightly. "Excuse me, everyone. May I have your attention for just a moment?" The room began to quiet, conversations trailing off, faces turning toward him with curiosity. My mother looked confused. My father's expression showed the first flicker of concern. Jessica was still on her phone, only half paying attention. "I'm David Morrison, and I'm Eleanor Brooks' estate attorney." His voice carried across the room with professional authority. "Since we have all the relevant family members gathered here tonight, along with many of Eleanor's dear friends, I thought this would be an appropriate time to conduct the formal reading of her will. I know the family has been eager to have this matter settled, and with everyone present, we can handle it efficiently." The room went completely silent. My mother's face drained of color. My father took a step forward, his expression shifting from concern to alarm. Jessica finally looked up from her phone, her eyes widening. "I don't think," my father started, his voice tight. "This isn't really the appropriate venue." David smiled politely, but there was steel underneath it. "Actually, Robert, as the primary beneficiary, Natalie requested that the reading take place here, in the presence of family and friends who cared about Eleanor. It's unconventional, certainly, but perfectly legal. And given that you've been difficult to schedule with for a formal office reading, I think this is an efficient solution." Every eye in the room turned to me. I stood near the fireplace, my hands folded calmly in front of me, my expression neutral. I met my mother's gaze and didn't look away. David pulled out a document from his jacket pocket. "This is Eleanor Brooks' last will and testament, properly executed and filed with the court. I'll read the relevant portions." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "Eleanor left very specific instructions about the distribution of her estate, and I want to be clear that these instructions are legally binding and have already been processed through probate." My mother made a small sound, almost a whimper. Jessica's face had gone from confused to suspicious. The guests stood frozen, sensing drama but not yet understanding its scope. David began to read. "To my beloved granddaughter Natalie Brooks, I leave my house at 2847 Laurelhurst Drive, along with all its contents, grounds, and appurtenances. This property is given solely to Natalie, in recognition of her love, care, and devotion throughout my life. She alone understood the value of what I built there, and she alone deserves to inherit it." The words landed like a grenade. My mother gasped audibly. My father's face turned red. Jessica dropped her phone, the sound of it hitting the hardwood floor sharp in the sudden silence. David continued, implacable. "My liquid assets, totaling approximately $130,000, are to be divided equally between Natalie and Jessica. However, the house, which has been appraised at $820,000, belongs entirely to Natalie." The math was simple enough for everyone in the room to do instantly. I was receiving nearly 90% of the estate. Jessica was getting pocket change in comparison, and my parents, who'd spent weeks planning to sell that house and distribute the proceeds according to their own twisted logic, were getting nothing. "There must be some mistake," my mother said, her voice shaking. "Eleanor wouldn't do this. She knew we were planning to sell the house to help Jessica. She knew the family needed that money." David's expression remained professional, but I caught the flicker of distaste in his eyes. "Eleanor knew exactly what she was doing, Patricia. She updated this will 18 months ago, when she was still in excellent mental health. She made her wishes abundantly clear, and she included a letter explaining her reasoning. He looked around the room. Would you like me to read that letter as well? Or would you prefer to maintain some privacy? Read it, I said quietly. Everyone here should know the truth. David pulled out the second envelope, the one with roses printed along the border, the one I'd read a dozen times in private but never aloud. He cleared his throat again and began reading in that same steady professional voice that made every word land with undeniable weight. My dearest Natalie, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I hope you're not too sad. I've lived long enough to know that death is just another season, and I'm ready for whatever comes next. But before I go, I need to tell you something I should have said more clearly when I was alive. You deserved better from your family. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Aunt Margaret had her hand over her mouth. Uncle Tom was staring at my parents with an expression I couldn't quite read. The mayor's wife looked deeply uncomfortable, like she'd stumbled into something she shouldn't be witnessing. David continued. I watched you grow up in the shadow of your sister. Watched you make yourself smaller and quieter so she could shine brighter. I watched your parents pour resources and attention into Jessica while giving you just enough to survive. It broke my heart, but I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. That parents have the right to make their own choices even when those choices are wrong. My mother was crying now, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, but they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of someone who'd been caught, someone who saw their carefully constructed image crumbling in real time. My father's jaw was clenched so tight I thought it might crack. Jessica looked between them and me, her expression cycling through shock, confusion, and finally landing on something that looked like betrayal, as if I'd done something to her rather than simply accepted what was rightfully mine. I regret that silence now, David read. I should have said something. I should have fought for you the way you deserve to be fought for. This house is my attempt to correct that imbalance. However late it comes. You loved this place the way I loved it. You understood the garden, the history, the care it requires. Jessica never did. She sees real estate value. You see home. Someone in the crowd let out a low whistle. I think it was Uncle Tom's oldest son, who'd always been the blunt one in the family. Several guests were whispering to each other now, the initial shock giving way to commentary, speculation, judgment. I'm leaving it to you, David continued, because you earned it with every visit, every hour you spent with me when no one else could be bothered, every conversation we had in the garden while the rest of the family was too busy for an old woman. This is not a gift, Natalie. This is recognition. You were always enough even when they made you feel like you weren't. The letter went on, every word a confirmation of what I'd lived, but what everyone else had either ignored or been blind to. When David finished reading, he folded the letter carefully and looked around the room. Eleanor Brooks was one of the most clear-minded, intentional people I've ever known. She knew exactly what she was doing when she wrote this will, and she knew exactly why she was doing it. This isn't a mistake or an oversight. This is justice as she saw it. No, my mother said, her voice rising, edged with hysteria. No, this is manipulation. Natalie must have influenced her, must have said things, turned Eleanor against her own family. This isn't right. David's expression hardened. Mrs. Brooks, I need to be very clear with you. Any suggestion that Natalie manipulated Eleanor would be defamatory and legally actionable. Eleanor made this decision independently, based on decades of observation. I was present for multiple conversations with her about this will, and at no point did Natalie influence, coerce, or even know about her grandmother's plans until after Eleanor's death. Then why didn't she tell us? My father's voice cut through the room, sharp and accusatory. Why has Natalie been keeping this secret for weeks? Why did she let us plan the sale of the house, let us make arrangements, if she knew the whole time it belonged to her? The room turned to look at me again, and I felt the weight of every gaze. This was the moment where I either shrank back into the role they expected, made excuses, softened the blow, or where I stood firm and spoke my truth. I stepped forward, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, because I wanted you to show me exactly who you were. I wanted to see how far you'd go, how casually you'd steal from me while believing I'd never notice or never fight back. I wanted you to reveal yourselves completely before I pulled back the curtain. My mother made a choking sound. Jessica finally found her voice. You set us up. You let us think we were getting that house, let us make plans, let me tell people about the money we'd have. You humiliated us on purpose. I turned to face my sister directly. The way you humiliated me my entire life? The way you got $150,000 for a condo while I got nothing? The way you've taken and taken and taken, never once questioning why everything flowed to you while I scrambled for scraps? Her face flushed red. That's different. Mom and Dad helped me because I needed it. And I didn't. My voice rose despite my efforts to control it. I didn't need help with college? With rent? With building any kind of foundation for my life? Or did I just not deserve it because I wasn't the favorite? The guests were no longer pretending not to listen. They were watching this unfold like a play, and I could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. People who'd known us for years were reassessing, remembering moments they'd witnessed, patterns they'd seen but never named. Aunt Margaret spoke up, her voice quiet but clear. I remember Natalie's 8th birthday. Pizza and a store-bought cake in the backyard. And I remember Jessica's 8th birthday 3 years later. The bounce house, the pony, the cake that cost more than my mortgage payment that month. Remember thinking it was strange, but I told myself it wasn't my business. Uncle Tom nodded slowly. I remember Natalie's high school graduation. I asked where you were, Robert, and you said you had to take Jessica to visit a college. I thought it was odd timing, but again, not my place to say anything. More voices joined in. A cascade of small observations, tiny moments of inequality that had accumulated over the years. My father's business partner mentioned how Robert only ever talked about Jessica's accomplishments, never mentioned his other daughter. The neighbor recalled seeing me mowing Eleanor's lawn every week while Jessica's car sat in my parents' driveway. The Historical Society president remembered Eleanor telling her that Natalie was the only one who understood what made the old house special. Each comment was another brick removed from the facade my parents had built. Each observation validated what I'd lived through. What I'd been gaslit into believing wasn't really that bad, wasn't really unfair, wasn't really worth making a fuss over. My mother was shaking her head, her hands clasped in front of her like she was praying. You're all misunderstanding. We loved both our daughters equally. We just knew Natalie was more independent, more capable of handling things on her own. Jessica needed more support. That's not love, I said quietly. That's favoritism dressed up as parenting philosophy. And you know what the saddest part is? I believed you. For 32 years I believed that needing less made me virtuous, that being overlooked was a sign of strength, that watching my sister get everything while I got nothing was somehow fair because I was just built differently. Tears were running down my face now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of finally saying out loud what I'd carried silently for decades. Grandma Eleanor saw what you did. She saw it and she documented it, and she did the one thing she could do to make it right. She gave me what I earned, what I deserved, what you were planning to take from me. We weren't taking anything, my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. We were going to split the proceeds fairly. David spoke up again. Actually, Robert, based on the documents Natalie provided me, you were planning to give the bulk of the proceeds to Jessica, with a token $5,000 extra to Natalie for her labor in cleaning out the house. Is that your definition of fair? My father's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The math was indefensible. Even if they'd split it evenly between Jessica and me, they'd already given Jessica $150,000 for her condo. Any additional money flowing her direction was simply compounding an existing inequality. Jessica was crying now too, but her tears were angry. This is so typical of you, Natalie. You always have to play the victim. You always have to make everything about how hard you have it. Maybe the reason you didn't get as much help is because you never asked for it. Maybe if you'd been less independent, less closed off, we would have known you needed support. The accusation was so absurd, so perfectly inverted from reality, that I actually laughed. I asked Jessica. I asked for help with my textbooks sophomore year, and was told the money wasn't there while you got a new car. I asked if anyone was coming to my college graduation, and was told to understand that your campus visit was more important. I've spent my entire life asking in small, quiet ways, and being told in equally quiet ways that my needs didn't matter as much as yours. She didn't have a response to that. None of them did. The truth was too obvious now, too well documented by witnesses, too clearly spelled out in Grandma Eleanor's letter. They could deny it, could try to reframe it, could attempt to paint me as ungrateful or vindictive, but the evidence was overwhelming. The party had effectively ended. Guests were making excuses to leave, gathering coats and purses, thanking my parents in subdued tones that couldn't hide the judgment underneath. The mayor's wife left without saying goodbye to anyone. The Historical Society president stopped by me on her way out and squeezed my hand. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. I'm glad she took care of you. Within 30 minutes, the house had emptied of everyone except immediate family and David. We stood in the living room surrounded by half-eaten appetizers and abandoned wine glasses, the decorations I'd helped hang now seeming garish in the harsh overhead light someone had turned on. This isn't over, my father said finally. We'll contest the will. We'll argue Eleanor wasn't of sound mind. David shook his head. You can try, but you'll lose. I have extensive documentation of Eleanor's mental competence, including evaluations from her doctors. You'll also be responsible for the legal fees, and trust me, they'll be substantial. Additionally, any attempt to contest will delay probate and cost the estate money, which means less for Jessica. Are you prepared to explain to her why you're reducing her inheritance to fund a losing legal battle? My mother turned to me, her expression desperate. Natalie, please. We can work this out as a family. You don't need that big house. It's too much for one person. We could sell it and split everything fairly, give Jessica what she needs for the renovations. You'd still come out ahead. I looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who'd given birth to me but had never really seen me. No, I said simply. This house is mine. Grandma Eleanor wanted me to have it, and I'm keeping it. Every inch of it. Every rose bush, every hardwood floor. Every window that overlooks the street she loved. It's mine because I earned it with years of showing up when no one else did. You're being selfish, Jessica spat. You're destroying this family over money. I'm not destroying anything, I said calmly. I'm just refusing to be destroyed anymore. There's a difference. Kyle, Jessica's husband, had been silent through most of this, but now he spoke up. Maybe we should go, Jess. This isn't going anywhere productive. Jessica whirled on him. You're taking her side? I'm not taking sides. I'm saying your grandmother made her decision, and it's legal, and there's nothing we can do about it. Fighting it will just make everything worse. He was more pragmatic than I'd given him credit for. Jessica looked betrayed, but she grabbed her coat and headed for the door. Before she left, she turned back to me. I hope you're happy, Natalie. I hope that house is worth losing your entire family over. I didn't lose my family, I said quietly. I just stopped pretending I ever had one. She left, Kyle trailing behind her. My parents stood in their decorated living room, surrounded by the evidence of their own performance, looking smaller somehow than they had hours earlier. My father couldn't meet my eyes. My mother was still crying, but quieter now, the kind of tears that came from genuine loss rather than theatrical emotion. I need you both to understand something, I said. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about hurting you. This is about me finally accepting that I matter. That my needs are valid. That I don't have to earn love by shrinking myself or accepting crumbs. Grandma Eleanor tried to teach me that for years, and I finally listened. My mother opened her mouth, probably to protest again, to try one more angle of manipulation or guilt. But David stepped forward. Mr. and Mrs. Brooks, I think it's time we all left. Natalie has made her position clear. The will is legal and binding. Any further discussion should happen through attorneys if you choose to pursue that route, though I strongly advise against it. He guided me toward the door, his hand gentle on my elbow. We stepped out into the cold December night, leaving my parents standing in their perfect house with their shattered illusions. The drive back to my studio was quiet. David followed me to make sure I got home safely, then walked me up the 4 flights of stairs. At my door he paused. You did well tonight. That took tremendous courage. It didn't feel courageous, I admitted. It felt necessary. Like if I didn't do it, now I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd finally stood up for myself. He smiled. That's what courage is. Doing the necessary thing even when it's terrifying. Your grandmother knew you had it in you. She just had to give you the tools. After he left, I sat in my studio apartment and let the enormity of what had happened wash over me. I just publicly destroyed my relationship with my parents and sister. I'd exposed family secrets in front of dozens of people who would spread the story across their social networks. I'd chosen a house and vindication over any possibility of reconciliation, and I felt lighter than I had in years. The next few weeks passed in a blur. The story spread exactly as I'd anticipated, rippling out through extended family, social circles, and eventually landing on a few neighborhood message boards and social media threads. My parents tried damage control, posting carefully worded statements about family misunderstandings and legal complications, but the truth had too many witnesses. People who'd been at that party shared their observations. Others who'd known the family for years added their own stories of favoritism and inequality they'd noticed. Jessica posted a long, tearful video calling me ungrateful and accusing me of manipulation. It got some sympathy at first, but then people who'd known Grandma Eleanor started commenting with their own memories. How Eleanor had talked about Natalie with such pride. How she'd said Jessica only visited when she wanted something. How she'd been explicit about her disappointment and how her son and daughter-in-law had raised their children. The narrative Jessica tried to create collapsed under the weight of too much contradicting evidence. Eventually she deleted the video, made her account private, and stopped talking about it publicly. My parents retreated into their Lake Oswego house, their social calendar notably emptier. The country club invitations dried up. The business partner my father worked with quietly dissolved their partnership. The Historical Society president stopped returning my mother's calls. They'd built their entire identity on a carefully curated image, and when that image cracked, there was nothing underneath to hold them up. I moved into Grandma Eleanor's house in January. The Victorian welcomed me like it had been waiting, every room full of memories and possibility. I spent my days painting walls, refinishing floors, bringing the place back to life. The rose garden needed serious work, but I had time. I had space. I had a home that was truly mine. Friends I'd lost touch with reached out after hearing the story. Some offered support. Others admitted they'd always thought my family treated me unfairly, but hadn't known how to say it. A few relationships deepened. Others faded. I was learning to be okay with that, to understand that not every connection was meant to last forever. On a morning in late February, I was in the garden pruning roses when I heard a car pull up. I turned to see my mother getting out, moving slowly like she'd aged years in the few months since the party. She stood at the edge of the garden, not quite stepping onto the property, and I realized she wasn't sure she was welcome. I set down the pruning shears and waited. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice small. I considered sending her away, maintaining the boundary I'd established. But curiosity got the better of me. I nodded toward the porch. "We can sit out here." We settled into the chairs Grandma Eleanor had kept there for watching the street. My mother's hands twisted in her lap, and I noticed the absence of her wedding ring. The divorce had been finalized 2 weeks ago, according to Aunt Margaret, who'd called to tell me. My father had apparently decided his wife was to blame for the family disaster and had cut his losses. Another abandonment, another betrayal in a lifetime full of them. "I don't expect you to forgive me," my mother said finally. "I don't even know if I can forgive myself. But I wanted you to know that I see it now. What we did. What I did. How fundamentally we failed you." I didn't respond, just waited for her to continue. "Your father and I, we told ourselves Jessica needed more because she was more fragile, more sensitive. And you were so strong, so capable, so good at managing on your own. It was easier to believe that than to face what we were really doing, which was choosing her over you every single time because she demanded attention and you didn't." She was crying again, but these tears looked different. Less performative. More raw. I spent the last few months in therapy trying to understand how I became the kind of mother who could do what I did. And the truth is, I saw myself in Jessica. The neediness, the insecurity, the constant hunger for validation. It was familiar. And you were like Eleanor. Self-sufficient, steady, quietly strong. I didn't know how to connect with that. So I didn't try. "It wasn't your job to try," I said quietly. "It was your job to love both your daughters equally, regardless of who you saw yourself in." "I know." She wiped her eyes. "I know that now. And I can't undo any of it. Can't give you back your 8th birthday party or show up to your graduation or split that $150,000 fairly. All I can do is tell you I'm sorry, and I understand if that's not enough." We sat in silence for a long time, the February sun weak but present, warming the porch slightly. A part of me wanted to accept her apology, to believe this transformation was real, to rebuild some version of a relationship with the woman who'd given birth to me. But I'd learned something important in the months since Grandma Eleanor's letter. Forgiveness wasn't required. Understanding didn't obligate me to reconciliation. I could acknowledge her regret without taking responsibility for her healing. I appreciate you telling me this, I said finally. I hope therapy helps you become the person you wish you'd been. But I don't think I'm ready to have you in my life right now. Maybe not ever. I need to focus on building something new, not repairing what was broken beyond fixing. She nodded, stood slowly, and turned to leave. At the edge of the property, she paused. Eleanor would be proud of you. She'd be so proud. After she left, I sat on that porch for another hour, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The years of quiet suffering, the breaking point in the garden, the strategic patience of letting them reveal themselves, the public reckoning at the Christmas party, and now this quiet morning where I'd chosen my own peace over easy reconciliation. I thought about Grandma Eleanor's letter, about her regret at not speaking up sooner, at not fighting for me when I was too young to fight for myself. She'd done what she could in the end, given me the tools and resources to finally stand up. But the courage to use them, the willingness to burn it all down rather than accept one more day of being diminished, that had come from me. I picked up the pruning shears and went back to work on the roses. They were coming back strong. New growth emerging from where I'd cut away the dead wood. By summer, this garden would bloom the way it had when Grandma Eleanor tended it. Beautiful, abundant, cared for with the attention it deserved. Just like me. The house sold itself eventually. Not the Laurelhurst house, my house, but the one in Lake Oswego. My parents had to downsize after the divorce, after the social exile, after the financial reality of maintaining their lifestyle without the business partnership or the country club connections. I heard they moved to a condo in Beaverton, something modest and forgettable. Jessica and Kyle divorced within the year. Turns out their relationship had been built on financial stability and social status. And when both crumbled, there wasn't much left. She moved back in with my father, the irony apparently lost on both of them. I occasionally saw updates through Aunt Margaret, who'd maintained contact with me and become something of an unexpected ally. She'd tell me about family gatherings I wasn't invited to, about the careful way people avoided mentioning my name, about how much smaller and quieter everything had become. I didn't feel triumph hearing these updates. Mostly I felt distance, like hearing about strangers whose lives had briefly intersected with mine. The anger had burned itself out months ago. What remained was simply the life I was building piece by piece, in the house that had always been meant to be mine. On the anniversary of Grandma Eleanor's death, I planted new roses in her garden, deep reds and soft pinks, the varieties she'd loved best. As I worked the soil, I thought about everything she'd taught me. Patience, care, the understanding that sometimes you have to cut away what's dead to make room for new growth. She'd been right about all of it. The sun was setting over Laurelhurst, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Inside my house, the one that bore my name on the deed and my history in every room, dinner was waiting. A simple meal, nothing fancy but mine. Earned, deserved, fought for. I'd lost a family that had never really been mine. But I'd gained something far more valuable. Myself. The version of me that existed without diminishment, without apology, without the constant effort of making myself small enough to fit into spaces that were never designed to hold me. And that, I thought as I locked the garden gate and headed inside, was worth everything. Spring arrived in Portland with the kind of gentle insistence that makes you believe in new beginnings. The cherry blossoms along my street opened in clouds of pale pink, and the rose garden I'd spent months rehabilitating finally showed signs of serious recovery. Thick green canes pushed up from the soil, buds forming in tight clusters that would bloom by May. Every morning I'd take my coffee out to the porch and watch the neighborhood come to life, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Belonging. Not the kind you beg for or earn through diminishment, but the kind that simply exists because you've created a space that fits exactly who you are. The house had become more than just property or inheritance. It had become the physical manifestation of everything I'd reclaimed. Each room I'd repainted, each floor I'd refinished, each piece of furniture I'd chosen carefully rather than accepting hand-me-downs, they all represented a choice I'd made for myself. The living room was painted a warm sage green that caught the afternoon light. The kitchen had new appliances I'd saved for and purchased outright. No loans, no help, just patient accumulation of resources. Grandma Eleanor's bedroom, the one that overlooked the garden, had become my sanctuary. I'd kept her reading chair by the window but added my own touches. Books stacked on the nightstand. Photographs on the dresser of people who'd actually shown up for me over the years. I'd started hosting small dinners, inviting the friends who'd stuck around after the family explosion, and the new ones I'd made since moving in. People who worked at the local bookstore where I'd become a regular. Neighbors who'd stopped by to introduce themselves and stayed for tea. A book club that met monthly in my living room. Everyone sprawled across furniture with wine glasses and passionate opinions about whatever we'd read. These gatherings felt nothing like the performances my parents had staged. Nobody was trying to impress anyone. Nobody was calculating social advantage. We were just people who enjoyed each other's company, who laughed too loud and stayed too late and left feeling fuller than when we'd arrived. Rachel Chun, the woman who'd become an unexpected friend, stopped by one Saturday morning with pastries from the bakery near her office. She'd been Grandma Eleanor's physical therapist during her final year, had spent hours at the house helping with exercises and mobility work. We'd reconnected after the estate settled, bonding over our memories of Eleanor, and our shared understanding of what it meant to be underestimated by people who should have known better. "Your garden is stunning," she said, standing at the edge of the beds where early roses were just beginning to open. "Eleanor would be thrilled to see what you've done with it." I joined her, surveying the work with the critical eye I'd learned from my grandmother. "There's still so much to do. That corner needs new mulch, and I want to add some companion plants around the bases. Lavender maybe or catmint. Something that'll support the roses without competing." Rachel smiled. "You sound exactly like her. That same combination of satisfaction and ambition. Never quite content but not in a restless way. In a way that suggests you understand that tending things is ongoing work, not a destination." We settled on the porch with coffee and pastries, talking about everything and nothing. Rachel's work at the rehab clinic. My plans to start freelancing as a grant writer, using the skills I developed in my nonprofit job, but on my own terms. The dating app disaster she'd experienced the previous week. The book club debate that had gotten so heated I'd had to physically separate two members who were arguing about whether the protagonist's choices were justified. "Have you heard from any of them?" Rachel asked eventually, her tone careful. "Your family?" I shook my head. "Not since my mother's visit in February. Aunt Margaret keeps me updated occasionally, but it's all distant news. Jessica apparently moved back in with my father. My mother's living alone, still in therapy from what I understand. They've all kind of scattered into their separate corners. And how do you feel about that?" I considered the question, really sat with it instead of offering the easy answer. "Mostly relieved," I said finally. "Sometimes sad but not for what I lost. More for what I never had in the first place. Like mourning the idea of family rather than the actual people. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense." Rachel stretched her legs out, tilting her face toward the spring sun. "You know what Eleanor told me once? She said the hardest part of getting old wasn't the physical limitations. It was watching people she loved make choices that diminished them, and knowing she couldn't fix it. She was talking about you. About how she'd watched you shrink yourself for years and felt powerless to change it." The words settled over me, bittersweet and validating. I wish she'd said something to me directly. Wish she'd told me I deserved better while she was still alive. She did, in her way. Rachel turned to look at me. Every time she insisted you take leftovers home because she'd made too much. Every time she slipped money into your coat pocket when you weren't looking. Every time she told you stories about her own life. About the time she'd stood up for herself or walked away from situations that weren't serving her. She was showing you what was possible. Modeling it. Hoping you'd eventually see yourself clearly enough to claim it. I thought about all those visits, all those conversations in the garden, all those moments that had felt like simple grandmother-granddaughter time. How much of it had been intentional? How much had Eleanor been planting seeds, waiting for them to take root, trusting that eventually I'd grow into the person she knew I could be? The will wasn't just about the house, I said slowly. It was about forcing a confrontation I would have avoided forever. She knew I'd never stand up for myself unless I had no other choice. Rachel nodded. She told me that too, actually. Said she was going to make sure you couldn't keep playing small, that she was going to create a situation where you'd have to fight or lose everything. She called it her final gift to you. Not the house itself, but the catalyst it would create. I sat with that revelation, feeling the full weight of my grandmother's love expressed through strategic intervention. She'd known I wouldn't save myself, so she'd created conditions where I'd have to, where staying silent meant losing not just property but self-respect, dignity, the last shred of hope that I mattered. She was right, I said quietly. If she'd just left me money, I would have accepted whatever my parents decided to do with the house. I would have told myself it didn't matter, that I was fine with less. But she made it impossible for me to do that. She forced my hand in the best possible way. That's love, Rachel said. The real kind, not the Hallmark card version. Love that sees you clearly and refuses to let you settle for less than you deserve, even when that refusal is uncomfortable. We sat in companionable silence for a while, watching a pair of robins build a nest in the oak tree that shaded part of the garden. New life, new beginnings, the perpetual cycle of growth and change that Eleanor had understood intimately. My phone buzzed with a text from Aunt Margaret. Call me when you have a chance. Not urgent but important. I excused myself and dialed her number, stepping inside for privacy. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying that particular tone that suggested she had news I needed to hear but wouldn't necessarily enjoy. Natalie, honey, I wanted you to hear this from me before you saw it elsewhere. Jessica's getting married again. Some guy she met at a grief support group, apparently. They're having a small ceremony next month. And your parents are hosting it at your father's condo. I leaned against the kitchen counter, processing. That was fast. They've only been divorced a year. Margaret sighed. Between you and me, I think she's panicking. She's almost 35, her first marriage fell apart publicly, and I suspect she's terrified of ending up alone. This man, from what I've gathered, has money. Not as much as Kyle's family did, but enough that Jessica sees security. And they're all just pretending everything's normal? Like the last year didn't happen? That's the thing, Margaret said carefully. They're not inviting extended family. It's going to be tiny. Just your parents, Jessica's future in-laws, maybe a handful of Jessica's closest friends. I think they're trying to avoid any situation where someone might ask uncomfortable questions or bring up the estate situation. So they've learned to operate in smaller circles where they can control the narrative. Exactly. And Natalie, I want you to know that I declined the invitation. I told Jessica I couldn't in good conscience celebrate her new beginning without acknowledging the damage that hasn't been repaired. She didn't take it well, but I stand by it. Warmth spread through my chest. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. What happened to you was wrong. What they did was wrong. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to keep family peace. That ship sailed when they chose favoritism over fairness for 32 years. After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen, in the house they tried to take from me, and felt nothing but a mild curiosity about Jessica's upcoming wedding. Not anger. Not hurt. Not even the bitter satisfaction of schadenfreude. Just distance. They were people I used to know, living lives that no longer intersected with mine. Rachel poked her head through the door. Everything okay? I filled her in on the news, and she listened with the kind of attention that didn't rush to offer commentary or solutions. When I finished, she just nodded. How do you feel about it? Honestly? Nothing. A year ago, this would have devastated me. The proof that they were moving on, creating new memories, celebrating milestones without me. But now it just feels like information. They're doing what they're doing, and it has nothing to do with my life. That's growth, Rachel said simply. When other people's choices stop feeling like referendums on your worth. The weeks passed in a rhythm I'd created for myself. Mornings in the garden. Afternoons working on grant proposals at the desk I'd set up in what used to be Eleanor's sewing room. Evenings with books or friends, or sometimes just silence. I'd started taking a pottery class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but had never prioritized. My first attempts were comically lopsided, but the instructor praised my willingness to start messy, to learn through failure rather than avoiding it. On the night of Jessica's wedding, I hosted a dinner party. Not as a deliberate counterpoint, just because it was Saturday and I'd planned it weeks earlier. 8 people crowded around my dining table, passing dishes family style, arguing cheerfully about whether the new restaurant on Division Street was worth the hype. Someone spilled wine on the tablecloth I'd inherited from Eleanor, And instead of panicking, I laughed and threw a napkin over it. These were the kinds of imperfections that made a gathering real. Toward the end of the evening, as we were lingering over dessert, one of my book club friends asked how I'd ended up with such an amazing house. I gave them the abbreviated version. My grandmother left it to me. My family wasn't happy about it, but it was the right decision. The friend nodded, not pressing for details she could sense I wasn't offering. Well, she's given you something incredible. This house has the best energy of anywhere I've been in Portland. You can tell it's been loved. It has, I said, looking around at the rooms I'd reclaimed and remade. And it will be. After everyone left and I was cleaning up, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I almost deleted it without reading, assuming spam. But curiosity got the better of me. The message was from Jessica. No greeting, no context, just a block of text that read like it had been written and rewritten multiple times before being sent. I got married today. I thought I'd feel happy or complete or something, but I just feel empty. And I kept thinking about you, about how you must have felt all those years watching me get everything while you got nothing. I don't know why I'm telling you this. I guess I just wanted you to know that having everything didn't make me happy. It just made me dependent. And now I'm marrying someone I barely know because I'm terrified of being alone. You were always the strong one. I'm sorry it took me this long to see it. I read the message 3 times, looking for manipulation or ulterior motive. But it felt genuine, or as genuine as Jessica was capable of being. A moment of clarity in what was probably several glasses of wedding champagne. A recognition that the script we'd been handed as children, the one that positioned her as the princess and me as the servant, hadn't served either of us well. I didn't respond immediately. Took my time washing dishes, making tea, sitting in Eleanor's chair by the window. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the garden. In a few weeks, the roses would be in full bloom, the culmination of months of patient work. Eventually, I typed back a response. I hope you find what you're looking for, Jessica. I hope you learn to be happy without needing someone else to provide it. And I hope you understand that forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. I wish you well, but I don't want you in my life. Take care of yourself. I hit send and then blocked the number. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. Jessica's epiphany was her own to work through. I wasn't responsible for her growth or healing, wasn't obligated to provide comfort or guidance. I'd spent enough of my life being what other people needed. Now I got to simply be. Summer arrived with the kind of heat that makes Portland residents complain loudly while secretly enjoying it. My roses exploded into bloom, drawing neighbors who'd stop during evening walks to compliment them. I'd invite them into the garden, show them the different varieties Eleanor had planted, share cuttings when people asked. The house became known on the block as the one with the spectacular roses, and I took quiet pride in maintaining Eleanor's legacy. I'd settled into freelance work that paid well enough to live comfortably without depleting the inheritance Eleanor had left. The money from her liquid assets sat in careful investments, a safety net I was grateful for but didn't touch unless necessary. I wanted to build a life sustained by my own work, my own choices, not just live off what I'd been given. David Morrison stopped by one afternoon with a bottle of wine and a smile that suggested he had news. We sat in the garden, and he explained that the statute of limitations had passed for contesting Eleanor's will. My parents could no longer challenge it legally, even if they wanted to. The house was irrevocably, permanently mine. How does it feel? He asked. Knowing it's truly over? I thought about it, rolling the wine glass between my palms. Like closing a book I've been reading my entire life. The story's done. The ending wasn't what anyone expected, but it was the right one. And now I get to start a completely new story without carrying that weight. Eleanor would be pleased, David said. She worried right up until the end that you'd find a way to give in, to sacrifice yourself one more time. But you proved her right. You were stronger than they gave you credit for. Stronger than you gave yourself credit for. I raised my glass. To Eleanor. For seeing me when no one else did. We toasted as the evening sun slanted through the roses, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. In that moment I felt the full weight of what I'd done and what it had cost. A family, however dysfunctional. A lifetime of familiar patterns, however painful. The possibility, however remote, of someday having the parents and sister I'd always wished for. But I'd gained something more valuable. Myself. Whole, undiminished, finally able to take up space without apology. A home that reflected who I actually was rather than who I'd been forced to be. Relationships built on mutual respect rather than obligation. The freedom to say no, to set boundaries, to choose my own path without constantly calculating how it would affect people who'd never extended the same consideration to me. By August, I'd started dating someone I'd met at the pottery class. Nothing serious yet, just coffee dates and long walks through the neighborhood, conversations that flowed easily without the weight of performance or pretense. He knew the basic outline of my family situation, but it didn't define me in his eyes. I was just Natalie, the woman with the beautiful house and the terrible first attempts at pottery, and the laugh that came easily once you got past the initial reserve. One evening we were sitting on my porch when he asked what made me decide to buy this particular house. I smiled at the phrasing, at the assumption that I'd chosen it through normal means. It was my grandmother's, I explained. She left it to me. It's been in the family for decades. You're lucky, he said, looking at the carefully maintained facade, the garden glowing in the evening light. Not just for the house, but for having family who cared enough to pass something meaningful down to you. I almost corrected him, almost explained the full complexity of what had actually happened. But then I realized he was right, just not in the way he thought. Eleanor had cared enough to pass something meaningful down. She'd cared enough to see me clearly, to understand what I needed, to create conditions that would force me to claim what was mine. I'm lucky, I agreed. My grandmother was an incredible woman. As fall approached, Aunt Margaret invited me to Thanksgiving at her house. She'd asked tentatively, knowing I might not be ready for anything resembling a family gathering. But she'd also been clear that my parents and Jessica wouldn't be there. She'd drawn her own lines in the sand, maintained relationships with people she felt deserved them, and refused to pretend everything was fine for the sake of holiday tradition. I accepted the invitation. Showed up with a pie I'd made from Eleanor's recipe, the one she'd given me years ago with a note about someday having a kitchen worth cooking in. Margaret's house was full of cousins I'd lost touch with, aunts and uncles who'd made the same choice she had. People who'd watched my childhood with discomfort, but who were now willing to acknowledge what they'd seen. Over dinner, stories emerged. Little moments people remembered. How I'd always helped clean up after family gatherings while Jessica played. How I'd brought homemade gifts to Christmas when I was broke while Jessica showed up with nothing, knowing my parents would cover for her. How I'd organized Eleanor's 80th birthday party almost single-handedly, spending weeks on details while the rest of the family showed up to take credit. These stories weren't shared to pile on my parents or Jessica. They were offered as validation, as evidence that what I'd experienced was real and witnessed, that the inequality hadn't been in my imagination, that people had seen it even when they hadn't spoken up. I wish I'd said something back then, Uncle Tom admitted over pumpkin pie. I knew it wasn't right the way they treated you. But I told myself it wasn't my place, that every family has their own dynamic. I'm sorry for that silence. I appreciated the apology, accepted it without making him feel worse. But I also understood something important. Everyone who'd watched and said nothing had their own reasons, their own fears about making waves or causing conflict. They'd failed me in their silence, but they'd also been trapped in the same system of family loyalty that had kept me quiet for decades. Blame could be infinite if I let it, spreading backward and outward until everyone was implicated. Or I could accept the apologies, appreciate the people who were showing up now, and move forward without carrying the weight of everyone else's guilt. After dinner, Margaret pulled me aside in her kitchen. Your mother called me last week. She wanted to know if you'd be here today. I tensed despite myself. What did you tell her? That you would be, but she wouldn't. Margaret's expression was firm. I told her that until she can sit with what she's done, really sit with it without defensiveness or excuses, she's not welcome at my table. Same for Jessica and your father. They had decades to make different choices, and they chose wrong every single time. They don't get to show up now and expect everything to be forgiven just because enough time has passed. How did she take it? Margaret shrugged. Not well. Lots of tears about being excluded from family, about how I'm taking sides. But I am taking sides, Natalie. I'm taking your side. The side I should have taken years ago. The words landed with unexpected impact. I'd spent so long believing I had to be alone in my experience, that asking others to acknowledge it was somehow demanding too much. But here was Margaret, making a choice with real consequences, prioritizing truth over comfort. Thank you, I said quietly. You don't know how much that means. She hugged me tightly. Eleanor told me to look after you if anything happened to her. I failed that for a while, got caught up in trying to keep peace. But I'm done with that. You deserved better then, and you deserve support now. Driving home that night, full of good food and genuine connection, I felt something shift in my chest. For years I'd thought healing meant eventually reconciling with my parents and sister, that real growth required forgiveness and reunification. But I was learning that healing could also mean building a different kind of family. One based on choice rather than obligation. One that included the people who showed up consistently rather than the ones who shared my DNA. Winter returned to Portland with characteristic rain and gray skies. I spent December decorating my house exactly how I wanted it. No gold and silver perfection. No carefully curated image designed to impress. Just lights in the windows, a real tree in the living room that dropped needles everywhere. Handmade ornaments from the pottery class mixed with the precious few I'd saved from my childhood. It felt warm and lived in and utterly mine. On Christmas Eve, I hosted a dinner for friends who didn't have family nearby, or who'd chosen not to travel. We cooked together, made too much food, played board games until late into the night. Nobody was performing. Nobody was keeping score. We were just people who'd chosen each other, creating new traditions because the old ones didn't fit anymore. At one point, standing in my kitchen surrounded by laughter and friendship, I thought about where I'd been a year ago, cleaning out this house while my parents planned to steal it, swallowing anger and betrayal, playing a role, while secretly planning my resistance. That version of me felt like a different person, someone I barely recognized anymore. The woman I'd become was harder in some ways, less willing to accept mistreatment or make excuses for people who'd hurt me. But she was also softer in others, more open to genuine connection because she wasn't constantly braced for disappointment. She took up space without apology. She said no without guilt. She built a life that felt authentic rather than acceptable. As the evening wound down and guests started heading home, Rachel was the last to leave. She paused at the door, looking around at my home with obvious affection. You know what Eleanor told me right before she died? She said she wasn't worried about you anymore. Said she'd finally given you what you needed to save yourself. What was that? I asked, though I thought I knew the answer. Rachel smiled. Permission. Permission to matter. Permission to want more than scraps. Permission to burn down everything that didn't serve you and build something better from the ashes. She said that was her real inheritance to you. The house was just the catalyst. I stood in the doorway long after Rachel left, looking out at my street decorated with holiday lights, my garden dormant but alive underneath, waiting for spring. Eleanor had been right. The house wasn't the gift. It was the mechanism that forced me to choose myself. To stand up, speak out, risk everything for the possibility of living authentically. And I had chosen. Not perfectly. Not without pain or loss or moments of doubt. But I'd chosen. And in choosing myself, I'd found something I'd spent my entire life searching for. Home. Not a building, though I loved this house with its history and its roses and its rooms full of light. But home as a feeling. As a sense of belonging to my own life. As the knowledge that I was finally irrevocably enough exactly as I was. The next morning I woke to snow, rare for Portland. The garden was blanketed in white, the roses sleeping peacefully under their winter protection. I made coffee and sat in Eleanor's chair, watching the world transform into something clean and new. In a few months spring would return. The roses would bloom. The cycle would continue. And I would be here in the house that was always meant to be mine, living the life I'd fought for. Not perfect. Not without scars. But wholly authentically mine. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The snow melted by afternoon, leaving the garden glistening and fresh. I spent the day doing absolutely nothing productive, wandering from room to room in my house, touching things that belonged to me, sitting in chairs I'd chosen, looking out windows that framed views I'd never take for granted. There was a particular quality to the light on winter afternoons that made everything feel suspended in time, peaceful in a way that required no effort or performance. My phone stayed silent most of the day. No demands. No obligations. No family drama requiring my attention or emotional labor. The quiet wasn't lonely. It was luxurious. I'd spent so many years surrounded by noise and chaos and needs that weren't mine, always tuned to frequencies of other people's distress or disappointment. Now silence felt like a gift I'd given myself, wrapped in the autonomy to decide exactly how I wanted to spend my time. Around 3 in the afternoon, I finally checked my messages. There was one from Margaret with photos from Thanksgiving, group shots of cousins and aunts and uncles who'd chosen to maintain connection with me. There was one from Rachel asking if I wanted to try a new hiking trail next weekend. There was one from the guy I'd been casually seeing, suggesting dinner later in the week. Normal messages from people who saw me as a complete person, rather than a supporting character in someone else's story. There was also an email that made me pause. The subject line read "Professional Opportunity," and it was from a woman named Dr. Christine Park, director of a family therapy institute in Seattle. She'd somehow heard about my situation through networks I couldn't quite trace, probably through David Morrison, who knew everyone in legal and therapeutic circles. Dr. Park wanted to know if I'd be interested in speaking on a panel about family estrangement and inheritance conflicts. They were hosting a conference for therapists who specialized in family systems, and she thought my perspective as someone who'd successfully extricated herself from a toxic dynamic would be valuable. I read the email 3 times, uncertain how to feel. The idea of standing in front of strangers and talking about the most painful parts of my life felt exposing in a way I wasn't sure I was ready for. But there was also something compelling about the possibility of turning my experience into something useful, of helping other people recognize patterns or find courage to make their own hard choices. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I sat with the question for several days, letting it percolate while I went about my normal routines. Gardening, writing grant proposals, meeting friends for coffee, living the life I'd built with such careful intention. Each day I'd return to the email, reading it again, considering what it would mean to say yes. Rachel was the first person I told about the invitation. We were at a coffee shop near her clinic, and she listened with the kind of attention that didn't rush to advice or opinion. When I finished explaining my hesitation, she tilted her head thoughtfully. "What are you afraid of?" she asked. Not judgment, just curiosity. I considered the question honestly. That talking about it publicly makes it too big. That I'll be reduced to just this one story. That people will think I'm bitter or vindictive. Or that I haven't really moved on if I'm still willing to discuss it. Rachel nodded slowly. Those are all valid concerns. But consider this. You spent 32 years being silent about what you experienced. Silence protected your family's image, but it destroyed your sense of self. Now you have the opportunity to use your voice in a way that might help other people who are living in that same silence. Doesn't that give the pain some purpose? Her words resonated in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. Purpose. That was what had been missing from so much of my life before. I'd endured without understanding why, accepted mistreatment without context or meaning. But if sharing my story could help even one person recognize their own situation more clearly, could give someone permission to choose themselves the way I'd finally chosen myself, wouldn't that transform the suffering into something generative rather than just destructive? I emailed Dr. Park that evening and agreed to participate in the panel. She responded within hours, grateful and enthusiastic, explaining the format and the audience. It would be therapists, social workers, mediators, people who worked with families in crisis. They wanted to understand the long-term impacts of favoritism, the mechanisms by which people stayed trapped in harmful dynamics, and the factors that finally enabled someone to leave. The conference was scheduled for March, giving me several months to prepare. Dr. Park sent reading materials, research papers about family systems and birth order dynamics, and the psychology of scapegoating. I read them with a strange mixture of validation and grief. Every pattern they described I'd lived. Every dynamic they outlined in academic language, I could translate into specific memories. Being the high-functioning child who received less attention. Being positioned as the responsible one who didn't need help. Being simultaneously depended upon and devalued. As winter deepened, I found myself thinking more deliberately about my story. Not just living it or surviving it, but understanding it as something with shape and meaning. I started writing not for the panel but for myself. Long documents that captured specific memories with as much detail as I could recall. The texture of feelings I'd had as a child watching Jessica's elaborate birthday parties. The exact words my mother used when explaining why Jessica needed more help. The moment in the garden when I'd overheard their plan to steal the house. Writing it down made it real in a different way. These weren't just emotions I'd carried privately. They were events that had happened, patterns that had existed, harm that had been inflicted whether intentionally or not. Seeing it laid out in black and white, I understood why I'd needed to leave. Not because I was weak or intolerant or unable to forgive, but because staying would have required me to continue accepting an identity that diminished me. And I'd finally valued myself enough to refuse. February brought rain that turned the garden into a study of grays and greens, everything dormant but preparing. I spent a lot of time in Eleanor's chair by the window, watching weather move across the sky, feeling grateful for the shelter of walls I owned and the life I'd designed. The guy I'd been casually seeing had become less casual. We'd had the conversation about exclusivity, about wanting to see where this could go without the distraction of other options. He'd met some of my friends, been welcomed into the small community I'd built. He knew about my family situation in broader strokes but didn't press for details I wasn't ready to share. One evening over dinner at a neighborhood restaurant, he asked about my upcoming trip to Seattle for the conference. I'd mentioned it briefly but hadn't explained the purpose. When I told him I was speaking on a panel about family estrangement, his expression shifted to something more serious. "That's a big deal," he said quietly. "How are you feeling about it?" Terrified, I admitted. But also like it's something I need to do. Like I've spent so much energy surviving and then healing, maybe it's time to help other people see their situations more clearly. He reached across the table and took my hand. "I think that's incredibly brave. Not everyone who goes through something hard is able to turn it into something that helps others. The fact that you're willing to be that vulnerable, that public, says a lot about who you are." His words stayed with me as I continued preparing for the panel. Brave felt like too generous a descriptor. Most of the time I just felt like I was doing the next right thing, making choices that aligned with who I wanted to be rather than who I'd been trained to be. But maybe that was what bravery actually looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but the accumulated weight of small choices made consistently over time. The week before the conference, I got an unexpected call from David Morrison. He rarely called without scheduling first, so I answered with a flutter of concern. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," he assured me. "I'm actually calling with some news you might find interesting. Your father reached out to me last week. He wants to know if there's any possibility of negotiating a settlement regarding the estate." I sat down heavily on my couch. "A settlement? The will's already been executed. The house is mine. What is there to negotiate?" David's voice was carefully neutral. "He's proposing that you sell the house and split the proceeds with Jessica. He's framing it as a fair resolution that would give both daughters equal inheritances. He's offering to drop any future legal challenges and to publicly acknowledge Eleanor's right to distribute her estate as she saw fit, in exchange for you agreeing to this voluntary redistribution." The audacity of it stole my breath. Even now, after everything, they were still trying to take what wasn't theirs. Still operating from the assumption that I could be convinced to sacrifice myself for the appearance of family harmony. Still believing that Jessica's needs outweighed mine so fundamentally that I should just accept less and be grateful for the opportunity to make my sister's life easier. "What did you tell him?" I asked, my voice tight. "I told him I'd relay the message to you and that any response would come from you directly. But Natalie, I want to be clear. You're under no legal obligation to consider this. The house is yours. Eleanor wanted you to have it. Nothing your father says or offers changes that fundamental fact." I know, I said quietly, "and I'm not interested in his proposal. Not for a second. But I appreciate you telling me rather than just dismissing it yourself." After we hung up, I sat with the anger that rose like a tide. They'd learned nothing. Experienced no genuine transformation despite the public humiliation and social exile. They were still operating from the same playbook that had governed my entire childhood. Jessica needs more. Natalie should understand. Family means sacrifice, but only from one direction. I drafted an email to my father. Kept it short, clear, devoid of emotion that he could twist or weaponize. "I received your proposal through David Morrison. The answer is no. The house stays with me as Eleanor intended. This is not negotiable now or ever. Any future contact should go through my attorney. Do not reach out to me directly again." I hit send before I could second-guess the finality of it. There was no door left open for reconciliation. No softness in the language that might be interpreted as willingness to compromise. Just a boundary drawn in permanent ink. The response came within an hour. A long message from my father that started with disappointment and escalated through anger to threats. He questioned my character. Suggested I'd manipulated Eleanor. Implied I'd stolen what rightfully belonged to the entire family. Accused me of destroying our relationships over greed. The message was everything I'd expected and nothing I hadn't heard before in various forms. The same accusations. The same refusal to acknowledge their own culpability. The same fundamental belief that I was the problem rather than their decades of favoritism and neglect. I forwarded the email to David Morrison with a brief note. Please add this to the file in case we need documentation of harassment. Then I blocked my father's email address, his phone number, and any other avenue of direct contact I could think of. The door wasn't just closed. It was sealed, locked, barred from the inside. Rachel came over that evening after I texted her about what had happened. She brought wine and sat with me while I processed the complicated swirl of feelings. Relief that I'd held the boundary. Sadness that it had come to this. Anger that they still, after everything, couldn't see me as a full person deserving of equal treatment. And underneath it all, a bedrock certainty that I'd made the right choice. They're never going to change, Rachel said gently. You know that, right? People like your parents, they've built their entire identity on a particular narrative. Acknowledging what they did to you would require dismantling that narrative completely. Most people aren't capable of that level of honesty, especially when the truth makes them look monstrous. I nodded, taking a long sip of wine. I think I kept hoping that eventually they'd wake up. That the consequences would be severe enough that they'd finally see what they'd done and feel genuine remorse. But that was naive. They're not going to have a movie moment where everything becomes clear and they beg for forgiveness. They're just going to keep rewriting history until they're the victims and I'm the villain. Exactly. And you have to make peace with that. They get to believe whatever story they need to believe. But you don't have to participate in it. You don't have to defend yourself or prove your worth or convince anyone of the truth. You just have to keep living authentically and let their version of events exist separately from your reality. Her words settled something in me that had been restless since receiving my father's proposal. I'd been unconsciously waiting for some form of acknowledgement, some validation from them that what I'd experienced was real and wrong. But I didn't need that anymore. I had validation from Eleanor through her will and letter. I had validation from extended family members who'd witnessed the favoritism. I had validation from the therapists whose research papers described exactly the dynamics I'd lived through. And most importantly, I had validation from my own lived experience, from the 32 years of evidence that I'd carried and could now name clearly. The Seattle conference arrived with typical Pacific Northwest weather, gray skies threatening rain but never quite delivering. I took the train up from Portland, watching the landscape shift from urban to rural and back again, using the travel time to review my notes and steady my nerves. Dr. Park had sent the other panelists bios. A therapist who specialized in family estrangement. An estate attorney who'd handled hundreds of contested wills. A researcher who studied sibling dynamics and birth order effects. And me, the only one speaking from lived experience rather than professional expertise. We met for dinner the night before the panel, and I liked them immediately. They were warm, curious, respectful of boundaries while genuinely interested in understanding my perspective. The therapist, Dr. Rodriguez, explained that they saw people like me in their practice all the time. Adult children trying to navigate relationships with parents who'd favored siblings, who were just beginning to name the harm, who felt guilty for wanting distance from family. The hardest part, Dr. Rodriguez said, is helping them see that wanting equity isn't selfish. That boundaries aren't punishment. That leaving can be an act of self-preservation rather than betrayal. So many people stay in harmful dynamics because they've been taught that family is everything, that blood bonds trump all other considerations. Your story, Natalie, demonstrates that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away. The next morning, we assembled in a conference room filled with about 200 mental health professionals. The audience was attentive, notebooks open, clearly there to learn rather than judge. The moderator introduced us, summarized the topic, and opened with a question about the long-term psychological impacts of parental favoritism. Dr. Rodriguez went first, outlining the research in clinical terms: depression, anxiety, difficulty with self-worth, complicated relationships with siblings, tendency to accept less in other relationships because it feels normal. Then it was my turn to translate that research into lived reality. I spoke about being 8 years old and learning that my birthday wasn't worth celebrating the way my sister's was. About standing on a graduation stage searching for faces that weren't there. About receiving $150,000 less than my sister for reasons no one bothered to justify because the inequality felt natural to everyone involved. The room was absolutely silent as I talked, and I could see people taking notes, nodding in recognition, seeing their clients' stories reflected in mine. The estate attorney talked about the legal complexities of inheritance disputes, how common it was for parents to assume children would split assets fairly even when they hadn't modeled fairness during life. Then I spoke about discovering my parents' plan to steal the house, about the forged signatures, about the casual certainty with which they discussed erasing my inheritance. When we opened for questions, hands shot up immediately. Therapists wanted to know how I'd found the strength to go public with the truth. I explained that it wasn't strength so much as reaching a breaking point where silence felt more dangerous than exposure. Others asked how I dealt with the guilt that came with disappointing family. I admitted I still sometimes felt it, that guilt was a trained response that didn't disappear just because you intellectually knew you'd done nothing wrong, but that I was learning to sit with discomfort rather than immediately trying to fix it by sacrificing myself. One question came from a younger therapist near the back. How do you know when to keep trying to repair the relationship versus when to walk away permanently? I took a breath, thinking about all the years I'd kept trying, kept hoping, kept believing that if I just explained myself clearly enough or proved my worth sufficiently, my family would finally see me. The answer is different. For everyone, I said slowly. But for me, it came down to this question: is the relationship actively making my life worse? Not just difficult or complicated, but genuinely harmful to my well-being? And if the answer is yes, if every interaction leaves you feeling smaller or less worthy or more confused about your own reality, then walking away isn't giving up. It's choosing yourself. It's deciding that your mental health and sense of self are more important than maintaining a connection that's destroying you. The panel ran over time because the questions kept coming. Therapists hungry for practical tools and real-world examples they could bring back to their practices. Afterward, several people approached me individually. Some shared their own family stories, tears streaming down their faces as they admitted they'd never told anyone about the favoritism or neglect they'd experienced. Others thanked me for being willing to speak publicly about something most people kept hidden out of shame or misplaced loyalty. Dr. Park walked me to my train that evening, clearly pleased with how the panel had gone. "You were exactly what they needed," she said. "Theory is important, but sometimes people need to hear from someone who's actually lived it and come out the other side. Would you consider doing this again? We have regional conferences throughout the year." I surprised myself by saying yes. Not immediately, not every month, but occasionally. When the opportunity felt right and the timing worked. Because Rachel had been correct. There was purpose in sharing this story. Not dwelling in victimhood, but offering a map for others who were still trying to find their way out of the fog. On the train ride home, I watched the landscape blur past and felt something settle in my chest. Peace maybe, or at least acceptance. My family would never acknowledge what they'd done. They'd never apologize or make amends or suddenly transform into the people I'd needed them to be when I was 8 or 18 or 28. And that was okay. Their journey wasn't my responsibility. My only job was to keep choosing myself, keep building a life that felt authentic, keep speaking truth when opportunities arose to help others do the same. The house welcomed me back with the particular comfort of a space that's truly yours. I dropped my bag in the entryway, made tea, and went to sit in Eleanor's chair. Through the window, I could see the first hints of spring beginning to show in the garden. Tiny green shoots pushing up through the soil, buds forming on the rose canes. The eternal cycle of death and rebirth, dormancy and bloom. Nothing stayed frozen forever. Even in the depths of winter, life was preparing its return. I thought about Eleanor, about how she'd spent her final months crafting a plan that would force me to fight for myself. How she'd understood that I needed more than inheritance. I needed a catalyst. A moment of such undeniable clarity that staying small would be impossible. She'd given me that gift wrapped in real estate and legal documents, knowing I'd unwrap it in my own time and find the truth inside. You are enough. You always were. Now stop accepting less than you deserve and claim your full life. I was claiming it. Day by day. Choice by choice. Boundary by boundary. Building something that looked nothing like the life I'd been taught to want, but everything like the life I actually needed. And Eleanor, wherever she was, I hope she knew. Her final gift hadn't been wasted. It had been the beginning of everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.